substantive seminar of this term. Before we begin, I wanted to introduce you to Bonnie Leong. She's a new member of the team at the front office, and kind of working in the team with Marcy and Linda and Gillian. So please make yourself known to her. She's very welcome to our community.
Introduce yourself. I've met some people, and hopefully I'll learn everybody's names as much as I can.
Welcome to our areas.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you.
So I've been charged with introducing Adrian Nel, who I met for the first time today. So this long acquaintance has let me know that Adrian is here from Zimbabwe via
Otago
University in South
New Zealand.
And a very tenuous, 7 degrees of separation, which eventually lands in here via Philippe Lobion. I can tell you that Adrian is not so keen on red, but his favorite color is brown. And that, is that okay?
That's great. Yeah.
His favorite band are the old recordings of Kings of Leon, which I agree with. And he's going to be telling you about the research that he's been doing with respect to various carbon sequestration initiatives around forestry. The last thing I was going to tell you is that he's going to talk about for about half an hour, so that we have good time for questions. But if there is a question of clarification while he's making his presentation, he'd be more than happy to be interrupted for that. One last thing, those of you who get nausea from Prezi, take your Daramine now. Thank you very much, Adrian.
Hi everyone, thanks for the great turnout and thanks for the introduction, Khari. I just wanted to start out by thanking Terry and Kai for having me here. It's been a really fascinating experience and I really enjoyed it. From the perspective of Kai's lab, to see a really highly motivated and engaged way of doing things, which is quite different to the sort of geography silo that I am sometimes in. And to Terry for having me here and for liking my really bright shoes. I wasn't really sure about them before. I'm not wearing them today, but yep. Okay, so thanks, Hadi, for the introduction. I'm going to talk today about climate change mitigation, and here I'm talking about carbon forestry projects. I'm going to talk about resource conflict, and I'm going to frame this in the terms of land grabbing. And in terms of a geographical reference, Uganda, which has been described by a couple of consultants as a funny place to store carbon. This is because of very contested land politics in some of these areas. And just to set out what I'm going to be doing, start out with a prologue, talk a little bit about myself and where I'm from and why I'm essentially doing this research. Then talk a little bit about background and context, and then give an overview of my broader research and some of the themes that are coming through in that, including changes in forestry governance, which I see carbon forestry as a part of. And then getting to the substantive stuff, a case study on a contestation between Oxfam and New Forests. New Forests is a British company with plantations operations in Uganda, 2 central forest reserves which they've leased from the National Forestry Authority, and which Oxfam have alleged resulted in the eviction of 22,500 people from these project areas. Just a disclaimer here, out of the different projects that I looked at, this was the one project that I wasn't actually able to get access to on the ground. Because there was legal proceedings going on, as I'm going to talk about, I couldn't speak with Oxfam. And despite all my efforts to chat with New Forests, that wasn't fruitful. I kept on sort of getting deferred and pushed along until it was time for me to leave, which is apparently fairly common sometimes. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the contestation itself and drawing from my broader experiences of carbon forestry and comparisons with other projects. I'm going to question what can this tell us about the connections between mitigation and conflict that happen in places such as Uganda. And then I know here at IRES it's policy focused, so I'm going to try and in concluding, draw some implications for policy, for projects, and for communities, respectively. Okay. So, the first zoom, the prologue. I'm from Zimbabwe, Bulawayo. That's in Matabeleland in the southwest. This picture here is actually of a safari lodge that my uncle owns. This is in the Matobo Hills, so big granite formations. And because of this experience of a tourist operation, I was very immersed in ideas of wild nature, coming along to Zimbabwe and experiencing this setting. It's important to note that there wasn't any arable land on this area, and it's actually not such a large area. It was purchased in the 90s. But what I do want to make the point in contrasting these kind of idyllic views of nature and of wild Africa with this, which is just about 10 k's down the road at a growth point, which was one of the centers of the communal lands under the colonial era, and just show the contrast that I've been exposed to, and often a lot of poverty around. As many of you would know, Zimbabwe has had an interesting last 15 years in which issues of land, which through my experience I've learned are never over, have come back to roost. The colonial legacy has been engaged with through a process of land reform, which saw the eviction of many white farmers. And just a writing which I find really interesting by this guy David Hughes, talking about whiteness in Zimbabwe. He said that early colonialists developed their relationship to this place, which was Zimbabwe, through an identity of wild nature instead of engaging with people. And that legacy is kind of playing itself out today, despite all the sort of authoritarian issues that would have come up in the elections, for instance. This picture here, I think, is a useful thing to keep in mind when thinking through the rest of the presentation, because this is my goddaughter. And this is one of many gum trees, eucalyptus, an invasive species, that were planted by the previous owners of this area. And I think the symbolic act of chopping out these trees in a context now where there's drought and increased climate sensitivity, and chopping out the legacy or the heritage of an unsustainable relationship with people and with the landscape and a socio-ecological system. So these were cutting off all the water. They were very water heavy. They take up a lot of water, and they were cutting off stream flows in the area. So all around the area, I spent many days in September chopping out gum trees. Okay, so I just want you to bear that in mind. So this is where I'm coming from, and this is what I bring to this research context. Okay, so background number one. Carbon forestry as a win-win. Carbon forestry is projected as a triple win, okay, contributing to climate mitigation and community development, but also simultaneously advancing the frontier of green economy. And here talk about it as the holy grail of conservation, these sort of win-win scenarios, okay? But concerns, what are the concerns that you might have with this? It problematizes the global implications. So here we're talking about global emissions, and in very local contexts, okay? So there have been incidences of violence and evictions, as I'm going to talk about, but what's at stake here often in these kind of discourses are the practices and the livelihood strategies of people in these areas, which have in many ways been termed survival emissions by some. So it's just going about their livelihoods. So there's a social conflict that we need to talk about here. To draw it into, to give some Canadian examples of people that have been talking about and thinking about these sorts of things. This is David Suzuki talking before one of the COP meetings of the UNFCCC, saying, if weak rules are instituted, forestry projects in developing countries could undermine efforts to protect the climate, enabling Canada to buy cheap carbon credits from questionable projects overseas, allowing the largest polluters to avoid reducing greenhouse gases at home. So this is in 2006, and I think that just gives you a bit of a background. Even more local, I'm going to draw from Kai Chan et al. In 2006, in a publication that said benefits are often difficult to identify, slow to materialize, diffuse, or discouraged by high transaction costs, and may accrue to certain sectors of society, such as political elites or geographically remote firms, while shutting out some local stakeholders whose actions may ultimately define and determine the future of these landscapes. Okay, background two. So there's this talk in Africa at the moment about land grabbing. A simple definition from the Tirana Declaration was it's the intensification of acquisition processes that involve a lack of free and fair informed consent, maybe issues of evictions, and a real lack of any baseline study, concrete contracts, and any real evaluation of social, gendered, environmental, or economic impacts. I drew out and I found what I thought was the most recent publication on land grabs, and this is out of the IIED in London. This is about a couple of weeks ago. And they were saying that large-scale land acquisitions are increasing in the pace and scale in the sites of the study, which was Indonesia, the DRC, Uganda, Liberia, Cambodia, and Laos. Okay, so what they were saying, areas of high biodiversity can be lost to commercial agriculture, sugar, palm oil, and rubber, amongst others, and to mineral extraction. One of the projects that they looked at in Uganda was in the series of islands in Lake Victoria called Kalangala, and these are designated as a central forest reserve, but it was sold off to Wilmar International for a biofuels project, which ended up cutting out 6,000 hectares of forest that was there, marginalizing local people. And essentially, when you think about the kinds of investors that were involved there, Global Witness did a report showing just a wide range of pension funds and banks that were involved, including Rabobank and HSBC. So what they go on to say in this report is many of these losses are from within existing state-protected areas, and land can also be grabbed for green purposes. So here, talking about expanded state-protected areas, land for carbon offset markets and RED, and for private conservation projects. So what they were saying was land grabs often damage biodiversity and dispossess local people from customary rights and livelihoods. And again, returning to what Kai was pointing out, maybe undermining synergies that might enable sustainable natural resource management. Okay, the third background slide, second last that I want to do. Different geographical perspectives. I'm not going to get into this too much, but again, I want to interpret it maybe through some people who've been thinking about this and writing about this locally. Okay, so a broad political economy perspective would say that, this is from a conference I was at actually with Paige in May, so this is Fairhead et al. They would say green growth is a transformation of the discourse, the way of talking about global ecology, to accommodate an ontology of natural capital and recast environmental problems no longer as an external, exogenous physical threat or the outcomes of a market-based practice or ideology, but rather recast climate change in terms of an idea of economic transition. So this is what Jankovic and Bauman have said. So what we really need is new incentives which are inside the market to correct market failures, climate change designed as, described as market failure, and now allow a new accumulation of opportunities for speculative capital under the auspices of being green, okay? So when I talk about speculative capital, I'm keeping in mind the 2008 credit crunch, so capital that's looking for different places to invest, and there's been a lot of literature, a lot of writing on Africa and agricultural land being one of these areas where this happens, okay? To bring it local and talk about Lister and Duvernay in the Lou, corporate sustainability and eco-efficiency efforts that go deep. So this is no longer just business as usual, and there is a real transformation of supply chains. But this is not for the good of the planet, but for profits and market share in a volatile, globalized economy. And maybe a more critical bent to this, it may limit potential for deeper solutions, okay? Just to draw quickly on Jeanette Balkin, and a different historical materialist perspective, which would say that historical processes are important in the production of, like I'll consider it in Uganda, a forest estate. She questions, reviewing an article by Matthews on work in Mexico, the naive assumptions of state hegemony and the belief that a global environmental initiative rolled out by a state and its global partners can actually determine what happens in faraway places. So there again is that question of determination and questioning how much control does the state actually have in these contexts. Okay, Uganda. And I think as Khadi was pointing out in his lecture last week, context is everything. What I want to say is, for me, this wasn't context. These were findings that I came to through the research. And this was engaging with a variety of different projects and as many forestry actors as I could. So a lot of this you wouldn't get upfront from project documentation of some of these projects. Okay, it was described by a US Embassy official as Uganda being a demographic time bomb. So 3.5% growth rate, really high, and a high net deforestation. But this deforestation, contrary to maybe the image of its people's livelihoods, which are causing degradation, it's not solely because of survival emissions, okay? There was a gentleman in the Ministry of Water and Environment who said, we haven't quite yet reached that level of population where it would be this huge issue. Actually, it's a management thing. So I want to kind of steer clear of a Malthusian interpretation of if it's just this population growth that's the problem. Okay, legacy of conflict and displacement. If any of you have seen that Coney 2012 video, you know a little bit that was a very poor representation of it, but of the conflict in the north of Uganda. There's also been cross-border conflicts, conflict going on in the DRC at the moment with South Sudan, and all of these combined with the local civil war when Museveni's national resistance movement came to power over Milton Obote, this is in the early 90s, have contributed to this context of real migration and movement of people. Apparently up to 20% of the population by 2009 had been migrant. So because of this, there's been a legacy of contested protected areas. Not so much in the national parks because there's tourist revenues which have been able to support them, but central forest reserves that were there, which are managed by the National Forestry Authority, an informal estimate by some people within the National Forestry Authority will say, look, approximately 90% of these are actually encroached. And they use this word unopened boundaries. So they'll say, you know, these central forest reserves are clear on maps, but when it's in reality, people aren't sure where these lines are. Okay, so there's a real distinction between de jure, in law, legitimacy, and de facto, what's the real processes that are happening on the ground. Okay, added to all of this, there's a very complex politics. So the NRM regime, quite authoritarian, has been described by one author as a hybrid regime where the state has come to power through patronage and the elites that have kind of bolstered it. And because of that has made enemies. And then it's very difficult to pull back from the situation because of the personal consequences that might arise. Okay? So to put it simply, there's been a narrowing of the state around these particular interests, around the national resistance movements and a real spread of patronage. And one thing that's kind of come about in the way that people engage with this, and I'm thinking here in terms of the red readiness proposal, a lot of this is quite in the open. I mean, people in Uganda and Museveni himself will quite openly talk about corruption as a real problem, but no one's ever named. So there's a kind of discourse of transparency without accountability, and that was one critique that the Global Witness report on Uganda's red readiness process. They said, look, you're not actually naming. You're not actually naming a lot of people who are responsible for a lot of these things. Okay, so a fifth thing, environmental concerns are invisible in the face of national takeoff. So there's this real drive for development. Anytime you're coming across any of the borders, you'll see these massive yellow signs with Museveni's face, and it'll say Uganda ready for takeoff. Okay. I was at a meeting last week here in Canada with parts of the Ismaili community who were kicked out during Idi Amin's time and who are now in the diaspora and looking to engage and invest back in Uganda. And there was somebody from the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance who was coming and saying, look, invest. You know, if you want to invest in forestry, we'll give you whatever exemptions you need. So there's this real drive to foster development and job creation as the way forward. And environmental concerns aren't really visible in this. And politicians there will say, you know, it's easier to build a road and then we can get votes. But something diffuse is something that they see in the background, such as water towers, which are actually essential to 80% of the functioning of the Ugandan economy, just fall by the wayside. And here, when I say the substitution effect, donors for a long time have been funding environmental sector in Uganda. And Andrew Mwenda is a local academic. He says that this is kind of part of the problem, where it's kind of allowing the state to avoid these issues. Okay, so I don't want to just say that it's corruption that's at the center of the problem. There's all sorts of different factors which come together. Okay, so the forestry sector, because of the legacy of conflict, and especially during Idi Amin's time, there was a real lack of planting. Okay, so the dominant view within forestry is that we need to build an industry. What we need is we need private companies, because we don't have the capacity. We need them to come in, and by planting trees, we'll be able to satisfy local demand, and we'll be able to stop deforestation on natural forests. Okay, but what that's led to is a kind of policy set of policy responses in institutions which really privilege only the private sector planting and have really marginalized natural forests. I can talk more about that if anyone else is interested. And there was a period of reform which instituted these new institutions. But what happened actually related to that Kalangala oil palm project that I talked about initially. The new National Forestry Authority at that time, the board resigned because this area was given away in 2009. And after that, there was some people put in place who effectively created a patronage machine, a corruption machine. So while the aim was to be efficient and to take forestry out of this context of corruption, it actually ended up inadvertently making it worse, as some actors in forestry would describe it. Okay, so what then has happened is there's been a bit of a blurring of the lines between what's legal and what's illegal. Local forestry officers aren't paid much. Often the payments are late. And because there's been a bit of a decentralization in terms of responsibilities for forestry management, without any resources, it's often the forests that bear the costs. So they might give away cheap licenses, and that might include some backhands. But also, and I think even more negatively, local governments might rely on forest officers to provide resources for local government funds. So it's a real perverse incentive. And that's when I talk about a kind of critique of the way that carbon forestry is rolling out. It's involved in quite negative processes, inadvertently and indirectly, but which are having some real costs on forestry in Uganda. This here is one of the projects that I was looking at, close to the two studies that I'm going to talk about now. Here it's in a woodland area, and woodlands are really excluded from RED or the ARCDM. And what's happened here, this is natural woodland, but it's classed as degraded because in some areas of this reserve, there's been encroachment and planting of crops. So this sets a baseline which the project implementers state against which they are avoiding further deforestation and replanting. So what you actually see here, this is area that's actually been cleared by the forestry company. And the point I want to make here is that the incidences of illegality are actually fostering incentives for plantations and companies to come in and plant. The two forestry reserves, for instance, that I'm about to talk about were classified in a biodiversity survey as forests of critical biodiversity importance. But because there's been this blurring of legality and illegality and forest clearance, usually there would never be any timber, pine, and eucalyptus planted there. But now, because of this, the forestry actors will say, look, it's degraded anyway, so let them just plant pine. But I will often, sometimes in some of these instances, question how degraded is this and why are we not starting to value the ecosystem services of woodlands such as this. Okay. So, section 2 of 3, my research. So, given this background and this context that I've developed, I'm trying to think about carbon forestry as a set of sort of 4 things. So firstly, it's grounded in colonial histories of land alienation and enclosure. Secondly, it's happening in a context of weak governance and poor land use planning. And it's bringing into being new constructs, so this is the idea of value in carbon, and relations. So these are transnational networks of private, non-profit, and public sector actors. And fourthly, it's taking some of these actors, such as conservation NGOs, into unfamiliar and uncomfortable territory, particularly those working with state agencies and when it's concerning issues of rights. So for instance, this is supposed to be a protected area, yet there's people on it. And when there are situations of evictions, which it's the state that carries these out, new actors aren't used to that sort of context. You know, they'll take it at face value that this is a protected area, this is a reserve that they've leased. Okay. In terms of how I'm thinking about the projects that I'm looking at, I started comparing them. I was like, okay, I'm going to compare RED projects, ARCDM projects, and voluntary offset projects, and just explore what are some of the implications for communities, what are the benefits that accrue, and what are some of the negatives. But I quite quickly found out, talking to forestry actors, that, well, firstly, a lot of these projects weren't going forward as many actors had hoped, but secondly, that these were more of a change in the way that forests are governed, and an extension, and as I'm saying it here, a deepening of the way that forests are governed transnationally. So that's what I'm really trying to explore in the bigger part of my thesis, which is still in the write-up phase. Okay, so just in terms of what is this change that I'm talking about, Benjamin et al. Have talked about, in East Africa, a change in the control of space from a territory, a protected forest estate in this case, to a flow. So in relation to carbon, and in terms of a supply chain of carbon. So it's this flow of carbon that really sets out how different actors come together around forestry resources. Okay, so the political ecology perspectives on this, very quickly. 3 phases of conservation, according to Vaccaro et al. The first one they talk about is fortress conservation. That's a contested idea, which we can talk about if you like. But here they're really trying to get at the relationship of what's described as the forest estate, how humans have tried to define and control these areas of forests, as really being involved in the rollout of the state in Uganda, in the way that the state has territorialized itself. If you think about how a leopard might control its territory, the state has done the same thing. And they talk about forestry initially being for colonial timber extraction, and only far later, when it was realized that there might be some negative implications for farming and for coffee products in particular around the area of Mount Elgin in the west, was the idea of biodiversity really brought into planning. Okay, and at the same time, of course, the colonial state was really in many ways funded by timber in one way, but also coffee in another. That was taxable, and instead of leaving subsistence farmers to do as they liked, they was encouraged and taxed that they would take up commercial farming practices for export. So there's a real relationship to the state itself, okay? Second, community-based conservation. This is a period that they're saying happened around the 80s and onwards, but the idea being states are inefficient, and this is kind of tying in with the era of structural reforms, which had a big impact in Africa. The state is inefficient, so what we need to do is we need to bring communities on board to actually engage with these resources. But because of the legacy of conflict in Uganda, that was really limited. And to the extent that it has happened later, there's been, as I kind of mentioned before, a devolution of responsibilities. So they'll decentralize responsibilities for management, but there's been no real accompanying of resources to accomplish that. And initially, when the national resistance movement came to power, this is in the 90s, there was an initial enthusiasm for protecting this forest estate, because as one academic there described it, they needed to make themselves felt as strong for their people. But a corollary of that is that it was actually donor funded. So what happened was there was evictions in many of these areas, sponsored by US aid, amongst others. And there were conditionalities attached to that aid, which said, if you're not going to go for a protected area model, you're not going to get the funding. And that enthusiasm from the NRM has faded since. There's been no funding, and it's politically unfeasible in a time when the regime is in survival mode, and they're now contested by opposition parties. it's just not politically tenable to evict people because then they're not going to vote for you. And in fact, the opposite is happening in some areas where politicians at times of elections will say to people, if you vote for me, you can go onto this protected area, and then subsequently I'll de-gazette it for you, which never happens. Okay, then finally, this more what I'm talking about now, neoliberal conservation, talking about an area, what are the changes that are happening in conservation in a place like Uganda and East Africa. So what they're saying is there's an upscaling, so a shift to extra state bodies such as the UNFCCC, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank, the United Nations RED program, for instance, which is setting out a lot of criteria about how forests should be managed, and the UNFCCC and the COP negotiations and initially Kyoto Protocol being the frame in which this is discussed. Secondly, a downscaling to the project level, the types of projects which I'm talking about, and at the same time, a privatization and deregulation that's happening. If I can talk about the forestry sector reforms that I mentioned a little bit earlier, there was a privileging of private sector actors, and this happened with the hope that the areas of the forest estate, the natural forest that was left, would be picked up by carbon forestry funding, for instance. I was talking with Jeanette Balkan, and one guy who was the architect of these reforms at the time used Guyana, where she works, as a prime example. He was like, in 2002, look, here's Guyana. They're going to get all sorts of funding from these carbon forestry offsets, and they're going to be able to sustain their resources. And he actually took Ugandan officials from the Ministry of Water and Environment over there. And when I talked to her about it the other day, she was saying that hasn't really materialized. There was a lot of money spent on trying to set it up, but it hasn't come through. And that's had a direct legacy in Uganda, which kind of justified, let's focus on this private planting, and the funds really haven't materialized. Okay. This is one picture showing in a contested, protected area near Lake Victoria, where this is essentially a central forest reserve. And this tree there, inside it, is a giant mvule tree. And for local people, that's a sacred cultural site for Kalichoro believers in the area. There's a village not far from there, also in the area and on its boundary. And I think the company knows that if they cut that out, there would be a lot of conflict that would arise from it. So that talk about, is the state really hegemonic? At the same time, there are overlapping examples of different relationships to place which happen. A second one, this is in Mount Elgon, and actually, Khadi, it's not the same guy, no. In Mount Elgon, this is again on a contested area, and this is what this group of people are saying is a cultural site. So this is the graves of the ancestors that they're standing on, and this is bushera, which is a local brew used at the times of circumcision ceremonies, which is an important cultural practice. And here, these young boys are a few months away from engaging with this, and they're saying, because we aren't allowed access to this area, which they claim as community land, we're unable to perpetuate our culture. So these are the kinds of different overlapping stories that happen in these places. Okay, so what are the implications? Essentially, I was talking about the way that governance is changing, and it's forestry governance beyond the state. It's not just the state anymore that's involved. Okay, so the state does maintain its relevance, but it's increasingly NGO actors, private donors, multilateral institutions that exercise governance capacities and come into friction with the kind of political processes that I've been talking about. So projects certainly can and do have benefits. That's not debatable. But these can be asymmetrical and limited, and here's one. This is a farmer standing in front of a tree that he's been paid to plant by the Trees for Global Benefit project, which Emily Anderson was actually looking at. But simultaneously, spaces of carbon sequestration can also be spaces of dispossession, exclusion, and marginalization. So this project here, this is the same one with the tree that I showed. This is a village on the boundary of the project and in the project area. And as you can see, it's really adverse conditions. So yeah, what I'm really looking at is the dissonance, how these different scales of governance overlapping and what are the problems with it. When I said benefits can be limited, this project, at the same time that he's planting trees for carbon sequestration, the funds that he's getting from these are not able to compete with alternative land uses. So here he's actually wearing KSW, Kenyara Sugar Works, and behind here, this is a giant sugarcane field that is he's actually cut out natural forest for, and he's getting paid more by them. So it's, I mean, the way he says it is, 90% of the people engaged in this project think that it's insufficient. So can you blame me really for doing this? Which is tough to engage with. Okay, so finally, and this won't be as long because I think I've taken quite some time, the case study. So this is now Oxfam putting out a big media spin on what they saw as a case of land grabbing. So as I said earlier, they alleged the enforced involuntary evictions and loss of land access between 2009 and 2010 of 22,500 people without genuine consultation or in relation to any baseline survey or census. So this is falling under the definition of what they would describe as land grab. So this is for, as I said earlier, 2 New Forests Company plantations leased in 2 separate reserves, central forest reserves. And just talking about the financialization that goes on with this, here, Agrivi, that's a business fund based through a shell company in the Comores, which had an 8.9% stake in that investment, of which the World Bank was a major player. And then HSBC also had a separate 20% stake in the project. So it was for pine and eucalyptus plantations, one of which was an ARCDM project. And here there's questions about additionality. Are these emissions reductions really additional if this project was going ahead anyway? But I'm not going to get into that. As I said before, a contested woodland. It's about 60 kilometers from the highway, and anybody in Uganda will say anything that far away from a major artery, people are going to contest and take their chances. And this is in the cattle corridor of Western Uganda. Now, the New Forest Company denied any involvement, and they said that people who they initially characterized as migrants and foreigners left voluntarily and peacefully. And it was the business of government, they claimed. And I've chatted to some respondents, one of which being a forestry officer for the area who used to be an employee of New Forests. And the way he puts it quite openly, and nobody like Oxfam or anybody has actually approached people like this, but he says, I have no resources to go about my activities. So when it came to this issue of encroachment, I actually approached New Forests, and he says they facilitated me. I don't think that was exclusively what was responsible for the evictions that happened. A lot of people in forestry will say that Museveni has a cousin that's linked to New Forests, and that may be one reason why there were evictions in this area and not in the other project, which I saw on the lake shore, which I showed you on the lake shore. And also through a local timber forum, the New Forest officials, amongst some other forestry officials, had met with Museveni in the months prior to these evictions. So I can't really speak to the specifics of that, but this is the kind of talk that's happening in Uganda around these kinds of issues. Okay, so this is what one human rights activist had to say about it. There were so many army and police, and the biggest problem was not involving the communities. They just gave notice and then beat and chased them. They nearly arrested some people from Hurinet, this is the human rights organization, and some New Forest officers were very arrogant. Some of these evictees, Oxfam was saying, claim lawful entitlement to the land, some for over 40 years, and saying they were Second World War veterans given the land by Idi Amin. So there's this kind of state schizophrenia as well that's happening. Sometimes they're told to go on the land, sometimes not. There are even clinics and schools in these areas that have been built by local government. But it was a central forest reserve, and the evictions took place. Oxfam's report was saying communities don't have access to the land, can't cultivate crops or generate an income. School fees can't be paid, and there's nowhere for them to bury their dead. So it's quite sensationalist kind of language coming out there. Okay, so what was this for Oxfam? I spoke to an Oxfam person at a conference in Auckland, and we got talking about it, and she was actually saying how this was supposed to be the first win on land grabs, this new campaign that Oxfam has started called GROW, and it's called their Food, Life, Planet campaign. But in this case, they were wanting to give a voice to local communities who lacked the power to claim their rights. And communities had actually tried to put in place a lawsuit, but they hadn't had the funds to follow it up. Okay, so this is a legitimate concern. But what actually happened was, after they made this allegation, Oxfam was threatened with eviction from Uganda, and the government was terming it. Actually, I think it was the vice president that's made the statement, and the Minister of Water and Environment that said it was a misrepresentation of lawful evictions from a protected area to which the company had no part. And certainly in this case, it was said there were army people who were involved. So, beyond the publicity, which actually did lead to a drop in the share price temporarily for New Forest, there was two forms to this contestation. The first being, and I think Ms. Lister might be able to talk a little bit more about this, with the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, and this is contesting the eco-certification of the project, saying, look, there's been all these issues, you need to revise the certification. But the FSC appointed SGS, who were also employed by the New Forest Company, and they rejected this claim. What they said, and Oxfam kind of pushed back against this, and they continue to dispute this. They say that SGS really had a lack of evidence. There were errors and inconsistencies, and there were lost documentation. One of the primary claims was, they said there's aerial photography which would show there was no encroachment in this area prior to 1992. 1992 is important. That was when the Land Act was promulgated, and they say anyone who's been on these areas for more than 12 years gets a stake and is subject to rights. So they also said migrants and foreigners, out of 542 households in the area registered by the NFA, only 6 were identified as Rwandan, and 1 was apparently listed twice. And then as the Uganda Land Alliance, who partnered with Oxfam, said, how can you say that these people are from Rwanda when they pay taxes and have voting cards? Okay, the second contestation that they made was much more successful. They complained to the IFC, the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, and the case went to the Ombudsman for material non-compliance with its own standards. And this is only actually resolved a month ago. So I've finally been able to talk to Oxfam and yet to talk with New Forests. So what's happened is the New Forest will support a community group to implement development projects. But as Oxfam themselves say, the community remains far from restoring their livelihoods and the outcome of the mediation process, but it does provide a basis for members to start to rebuild their lives. But the kinds of development projects that plantations companies have been putting in place have been very limited, and I would sort of question two things really: how many members of this community are going to benefit. Already many people have moved away and arrived in other project areas that I've been looking at. So there is no real away in forestry, but they're like, these people should just go away and go somewhere else, but they've pitched up in another project. And then the second thing is, how effective is this actually going to be? If there's no real settlement, or if it's not substantial enough, there's just going to be a re-encroachment. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through this. Basically, the form of governance that has come about is not about political citizenship anymore. It's about the stakes that people have in forestry and in these sort of flow-based governance relationships. And these governance arrangements can be ad hoc and informal. So that the conflict resolution that came about, it was with the IFC, and the government really wasn't involved when these are issues that should be placed at their doorstep. I don't want to knock the Oxfam contestation, but I think in many ways it's addressing symptoms and not causes. And this kind of focus on land grabbing, it's really myopic, or can't engage with the deeper forms and problematic governance tensions that underpin them and make them possible. Just conclusion and recommendations now. Some of the findings may, I think, lend weight to a critique of win-win. And a second thing, it's never over with land. Under conditions of coercion, in situations of adversity, people refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of territory of the state. And I think this needs to be considered more explicitly and pragmatically in policy. There sort of needs to be a chopping out of the gum trees, as I showed in that first slide from Zimbabwe. Okay, and the debate around green grabbing needs to move beyond a generic idea of a land grab, and it really needs to talk about these governance failures. And how is it normal? How these expulsions of people, just how are they the norm? And what is the accumulation of dispossession over a long colonial history of peoples in these areas? Okay, so what does this mean for governance? Need to reassess the discourse of encroachment. There are people in Uganda who are starting to talk about this. The Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment are starting to say there needs to be a bit of review. CARE International is also saying we need to think about this. And part of their thinking is, look, we also really actually need to bring politicians on board. It is a bit of a crisis. Timber stocks are declining, and I think the government is starting finally to realize that this is an issue. The Ministry of Water and Environment, for instance, put a ban on timber cutting for 3 months last year, which was incredibly ineffective, primarily because some of the illegal loggers were lobbying Parliament the next week. But there really needs to be a discussion about this. Secondly, there needs to be a reconsideration of production zones in these central forest reserves. They're zoned as to strict conservation areas, buffer zones, and production zones. And at the moment, it's only the National Forestry Authority or any planters that are able to get benefits from these. And what I think needs to happen is they need to legitimize local jurisdictions and local communities where there have been contestations to actually give them a stake in managing these areas. One saying that people will say, Byoya Banswa. Okay, so what this basically means, they're talking about, Nswa is these little termites, flying ants. And when they land, they drop their wings. And they say, all we get from these projects are the wings, whereas the ant has been taken by the National Forestry Authority or some of the companies. What we really need to is some incentives to manage these areas. And here I'm talking about timber resources. Often when communities are allowed onto some of these areas, it's only for non-timber forestry products, but there needs to be a stake. And this idea of taonja, that's if a company is going to be clearing areas, maybe communities would be allowed to plant in the interim while the canopy is growing up. Okay, I think there needs to be a discussion on possibly recombining forest institutions. At the moment, there's a distinct split, and people are talking about this in Uganda, but it's uncertain about where this is going to go. And I think related back to this idea of reconsidering production zones, I think the National Forestry and Timber Protection Act of 2003 is very limiting in what types of uses are allowed in these areas, and that needs to be revisited. And then just the last two, there needs to be greater coordination. So agricultural extension schemes currently don't consider tree planting at all. This needs to be included. And charcoal production is considered illegal at this stage, but it actually it's providing 90% of Uganda's energy needs. So there needs to be an exploration of legality and illegality. I'm not sure how that would play out, but it needs to be on the agenda. Okay, for projects themselves, there needs to be thorough assessments and better understandings of the local context to avoid conflict, and importantly, in the context of carbon sequestration leakage. If you're just displacing people that are going to carry on deforestation elsewhere, it's not effective mitigation. Also, a lot of bad press can come from these projects, and it's been shown that these can really undermine projects themselves. And I think, again, coming back to that idea of addressing benefit sharing, giving communities a real stake in some of these projects is important. And maybe considering projects as conflict management strategies explicitly. There's one project, let me see if I can get to it. If you can see it on this side here, unfortunately the slides cut it off. But this is in a buffer area, what they've now classified as a buffer area of this national park. Communities are allowed to plant coffee, but simultaneously planting trees. And you can't really see over there, but they've planted a line of eucalyptus, a 10-meter wide strand of eucalyptus trees that when it comes to harvesting, they will actually get the benefits from. And the company, the project has paid for this. And over there on the mountain, on Mount Elgin, this is actually the national park. And they're also doing enrichment planting inside the park. So this is a project that's actually engaging with this legacy of conflict explicitly. And I think that needs to happen more. And then further, collaborations with development and human rights groups, Makerere University, for instance, for actors that might not engage with these sorts of problems on an everyday basis. Okay, so finally, last slide. What are the implications for communities? So the real thing about these investments is the speed and scale in which they're happening. And I think actors aren't able to keep up. So what really is necessary is greater community organization. The same guy who talked about, the human rights officer who talked about new forest evictions, he said, where people are organized, they can demand their rights. And where you demand, then you can compromise and agree. However, if you don't demand, the companies do things, and 30 years later, the repercussions surface. And I think what's necessary is it's essential to make community stakes clear. If rights isn't a sufficient incentive for their concerns to be regarded, what is it that's going to do? How is it that they make their stakes visible? Okay, and going to local government representatives is not actually going to help their case. What actually becomes important is media and maybe the national grievance process for RED, but there's a bit of a contradiction there because the CDM projects, like the ones I'm talking about, don't actually have access to this RED mediation strategy, which is at the national level. So perhaps, and I think this is maybe a role for academics, is how do you get this story out there of communities? I think what they maybe need to establish are community-based organizations. These are registered. And I don't want to romanticize communities or paint these forums as a perfect intervention, but what I think these could be was just forums in which communities could discuss their own issues and be able to represent that in a way that is legible to forestry actors. And then finally, this issue of indigeneity. What happened in Uganda was the way that the state rolled itself out was not through expropriation exclusively like you had maybe in South Africa under apartheid and Zimbabwe. It was more indirect rule. So it was rule through what was then termed the Four Kingdoms of Uganda, and then it spread out to encompass this territory. Now, one of the issues about identity within this context is that people who are termed indigenous or forest-dependent communities were only in very marginal parts of the country. Two groups of people. The Benet in Mount Elgin, and then the Batwa in Bwindi National Park in the southwest of the country. And I think where communities have been able to engage constructively with carbon forestry is where they've claimed this self-identification of indigenous. And I think there needs to be a little bit more of that, talking about it in that kind of terms in Uganda. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. A few quick questions.
How long was I?
An hour.
An hour?
Yeah.
Sorry, everybody. Yep. Yep. For those specific members? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So I just have to repeat this for the camera. I think the question was around what happens to the people that have been sort of defined as encroachers and have been evicted from these areas. There was a quote saying that it's not like they're human, and how might the mediation process restore any dignity to them. I think this gets back to that idea of invisibility. They are not legible, they're not understandable within the carbon forestry governance or forestry governance in Uganda. And this is the condition of actually a lot of people in Uganda. I've spoken with furniture manufacturers that are sort of illegally squatting on the sides of roads and building in shells of half-built buildings. And the way they see it is they're like, look, my existence, we're just fighting for happiness. That's what we do. We just do as much as we can in this context of adversity. In Zimbabwe, there's this word korokoza, which translates to kind of hustling. So everyone is hustling and just trying to make the best that they can do. So these kind of evictions in some ways might be normal for people. And it's just another part of you know, a very their lived experience. It's just what they have to deal with. And that's why I'm sort of questioning what is the ability of this kind of mediation to actually really address that or engage with that. And I think in order to be given dignity, they need to reclaim that idea, that identity of indigeneity, which then gives them a stake in the way that this process unfolds. I don't know if that answers that.
I was wondering about the process throughout the whole chain of governance for the companies that are actually carrying out these actions or responsible for projects that meet the missions. I would think that in some cases, perhaps the companies would do it themselves, or they would sign a deal where they would promise the land with no one on it, and the government takes care of it. Like, what's the full range
Yeah.
of how these missions are
Yeah.
carried out, and how much awareness do the companies do?
Yeah. So what a lot of people in Uganda would say was that New Forests actually would have done a lot more if they could have. They would have engaged more in development projects, but they weren't allowed to. This is when I talked about policy straitjackets, because this is a protected area. No one else is allowed on there. You can't engage with these people because they're illegal. In another area, the people will say, we don't get any NGOs coming to us just because we're defined as illegal. The one project tried to instigate a community planting effort on some of these areas, but after a while they were told by the National Forestry Authority, you can't actually engage with that. So I don't want to say that I'm lumping it all on the companies. I'm saying there's some real dissonance and there's gaps through which these processes happen, through which evictions like this happen, and I definitely agree. I think there's probably more scope for better coordination that would avoid some of the more negative things that happen. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's two ways to interpret that. The one is with people at the level of the forestry institutions, and in many ways they're quite frustrated. They said there was all this promise of funding that was going to come, particularly through RED, but it just hasn't materialized. They're like, so after Rio, we put in place all these great, we put in place all these policies, but we never fulfilled on those. And now the whole donor agenda has changed to RED, and now what we're trying to do is just become relevant for this process. And yet there's so much actual work we could be doing. They're always like, all we do is talk and take tea, and the forests continue to fall. So that's the way that some people are talking about it at the level of national governance. And then finally, when you talk about communities, there are a lot of communities that are actively avoiding the state. Mount Elgon, for instance, the first African carbon forestry project actually collapsed because communities didn't want to engage at all. And it's been a strategy that they've employed since the early colonialism, to just stay away from anything to do with the state and just do things on their own. So they don't want to engage at all. And I think that voice also needs to be heard. Yeah.
Okay, well, before you have a chance to buttonhole it and ask some questions in the podium, while it's still here with us for about another month and a half, but why don't you join me in thanking him for a very interesting. Next week, a mystery talk. I don't know what it is. I haven't prepared it. Sorry, but I look forward to seeing you.
Sorry, Khadi, I thought, when were you flashing the eyes?
Minutes.